Thanks for coming with me. I have some plans for tonight. Some talking to do, some sharing to do. Stay tuned. Coyotes have fired up for the evening. Heating up some water in my Morris pot, little bush pot. I really love this thing. It's just a great little pot. Yeah, I could pay for fuel to run a camp stove to heat up my water, or I could just find some wood laying around and throw a bush pot over it with some water in it, and voila, boiling water. Bushradical tagged me in the 8 questions challenge. And I've done quite a bit of thinking about these questions. I have quite a bit written down here. Lots of thoughts to share. So how this 8 question challenge works is there's 8 questions. If somebody tags you in the challenge, you answer these 8 questions in a video, and then you tag 5 other folks, and then hopefully they'll do it. So at the end, I'll share my tagged fellow YouTubers. Question number 1: what is your most memorable camp? This was a pretty tricky question. I've had so many camps over the years in so many wonderful places. that it's really hard to pick one as being the most memorable. But one that my mind was drawn to, which I suppose would maybe mean it's one of the more memorable ones anyway, is a little spot which is on the it's on the eastern shore of Sassaginigak Lake, which is way up in the Attakaki Provincial Park up in Manitoba, up on kind of east of Lake Winnipeg ways. And at this particular campsite, I was lucky enough to camp at this particular spot 3 different occasions, each 2 years apart, and it was always while I was on one of these 3 flying canoe trips that I was fortunate enough to go on over the years back in the 90s. First one was in 95, then I went on a 10-day trip in 95, a 15-day trip in 97, and then another 10-day trip in 99. And our route on the 10-day trip was pretty much the same. On the 15-day trip, we went down a different river and then kind of joined up with kind of the usual route that we tended to go on. But every time after crossing this rather large lake with many islands on it, apparently Sassaginigak means lake of many islands in one of the native languages. But there was a spot once we crossed the lake, we would always seem to camp kind of at the mouth of the river that flowed out the other side of the lake. And it was a really beautiful campsite. It was just on this little point of rock that stuck out, and you could look out across the lake and you could see some of the islands. And the biggest island had a fire tower on it that you could see out the distance. It was about just a little over a mile and a half away or so. And the first time we actually camped there, that evening, a bunch of us paddled out. We took 2 or 3 canoes with probably 3 of us in each of them. We paddled out across the lake over to the island where the fire tower was, and we climbed up the fire tower, and by the time it was time for us to head back, the sun was pretty much gone. I guess our time must have gotten away from us or something, because it was pretty much dark by the time we started heading back across this 1.5 mile stretch of the lake, and a rainstorm blew up. So it was pretty much dark, completely dark. We had waves and wind and rain, and we were trying to get across this dark, pretty much pitch black expanse of lake. And eventually we saw this one little point of light out on the distant shore, and we just assumed that little point of light must have been our camp somehow. And so we followed that little point of light. And I remember I was in the stern of the canoe I was in, and I just made sure I steered that canoe just right to that light. And sure enough, that light definitely guided us home that night. This canoe trip was one of these Boy Scout high adventure trips, and one of our scoutmaster, actually, he realized that we were going to have a hard time making our way back to camp without some sort of guidance. So what he did was he took a little white gas camp stove, and there's this little piece of like sheet aluminum that was laying around the campsite, just some discarded scrap. And he kind of bent it into a reflector, put it behind that camp stove, and then kept putting little twigs on top of the camp stove, which would then flame up into a nice yellow bright flame. And it worked. It guided us home. I just have a lot of memories, other memories of that campsite. Like seeing moose out swimming across some of the waters there. There was a tiny little trapper's cabin that was like on the island or the shore just right across from that campsite. I remember I paddled a canoe over there just to take a look at it. It wasn't much. It was pretty much just a bunch of plywood stuck together. Nothing fancy at all. It was definitely kind of a neat little place, and I was lucky enough to stay there on 3 different occasions. And I think one of the trips we may even have had a layover day where we spent 2 nights there. But yeah, that little camp on the east shore of Sassaguinigak Lake really stands out in my mind as one of the most memorable. Question 2. Do you prefer to camp alone or in a group? The answer to this question, it really depends. Sometimes I really would rather go out and camp by myself. Sometimes a bit of solitude is really good for me. I'm the type of person that enjoys that. Sometimes I just kind of need to go away by myself to just kind of be with my own thoughts. To just kind of maybe think through some stuff, just kind of ponder some things on my own, at my own pace, at my own quiet kind of way. Sometimes that sort of thing is really good at recharging my batteries, which can, really get run down with work and the general kind of just kind of the unfortunate part of modern life, the stuff that you have to deal with. It's kind of good to just get away by yourself sometimes. And there were some times in the past, one little solo backpacking trip I took out in the mountains of northern Colorado about 10 years ago. It was while I was doing my my X-ray program clinicals, and I was out in northeastern Colorado, and I drove out. It was over the July 4th extended weekend, and I went out by myself, and I spent 2 nights out, camped at this high alpine lake. I really, at least by that second night, I really had feelings of loneliness, which they were profound enough that I remember them today. How I sat out there and just felt alone out in this really beautiful area, but I was just there by myself. I didn't have anybody to share it with, and that kind of bothered me. And I think a lot of that was very situational at the time. That year that I spent doing my clinicals, I was out far away from home, and I was by myself. I lived by myself. So I really didn't have any friends in that town. I had a good number of friends that lived in the more urban area of Colorado along the Front Range, but that was a pretty lonely year in general. And then when I went out by myself, that really heightened that loneliness. But that said, that trip was very needed. It very much so recharged my batteries, really helped me kind of keep going along the course of that part of that year, because that was kind of a rough year for me. And that those trips to the mountains, that I, at least half the time, I was by myself when I went on them, and those those really were very, very needed trips. But I would have to say, like if I were to make that same trip to that same spot, tomorrow, and spend 2 nights out there, I am pretty sure I would not experience those feelings of loneliness like I had out then, because I don't live a lonely kind of day-to-day existence like I did then. I have my wife. I'm just sure that experience would be different, and I would probably enjoy the solitude more. And like I said, the answer to this question definitely just kind of depends on lots of things. There are other times where I definitely enjoy camping with a group, because there's people to share the experience with. It's really nice to be able to, when you have good experiences, it's very nice to be able to share those with other people, and you can't do that if you're out by yourself. And also, I've touched on this in one of my recent videos. Over the years, I have really enjoyed some of the campfire conversations and talks, and just kind of campfire storytelling sessions that I've been able to listen to. And like I said, it's not like a fictional storytelling thing, but people get around a campfire and they start telling stories of trips they'd gone on in the past to just different places, different parts of the world, different parts of North America, and I really enjoy those just sitting around a fire, staring into the fire, and being able to listen to somebody share some of their experiences in the outdoors. That's a really special thing to be able to do, and it takes a group to do that sort of stuff. So my answer to the question, solo or with a group, I almost don't know really which to pick. I guess just situationally recently, I almost all my trips have been solo, so I guess I'll pick solo as the answer to my question, but that one really depends. And solo, you definitely miss out on some other experiences. I'm hanging out here in my hammock, all cozy in my sleeping bag. And the next question, I actually want to pull out a prop and show it. And I don't really want to mess with that right now. So I think I'm going to leave the rest of these questions until tomorrow. So I want to put these away for now, for tomorrow. And I'm going to pull out a book, do a little reading before I go to sleep. And this is A Rugged Land of Gold by Martha Martin. I've had this book for quite a while. I've never got around to reading the whole thing. So maybe it's time to fix that. Kind of like the time of morning where the sun's shining on your back actually still feels good. So I know a few hours from now the sun's shining on me, it's probably not going to feel the greatest. This tree doesn't exactly belong here in this landscape. It's a pine, and in Kansas, pine trees don't reproduce naturally. So if you see a pine tree, it's there because somebody planted it at some point in time. Yeah, we have lots of cedar trees, juniper trees. Well, all right, the continuation of the 8 questions list. I'm sitting in the shade of this really wonderful pine tree, whatever it is. I almost wonder if it's a ponderosa pine, even though it doesn't quite look like what I'm used to seeing in the mountains. Of course, its natural environment, and we're not in this tree's natural environment, so maybe that's why it looks a little funny. Anyway, it's a great shade tree, and if the wind blows just enough, I can hear that wonderful sound of the wind blowing through the pine needles, which I love that sound. Anyway, question number 3. What is your favorite knife? I have to say, at this point in time, this Mura, or I think it's pronounced more like Mura, Companion is probably my favorite knife. I use this more than any of my other knives. The great thing about this knife is I paid all of, I think, around maybe $17 for it. I got it a little over a year ago, so I've been using this thing for the last 13 months or so. And I have to say, I've been very pleased with this knife. I haven't owned a whole lot of fixed blade knives. I have a Buck Special, I believe is the model. It's like a 119, something like that. I've had that knife since 1995. That was the first fixed blade knife I ever owned. And I'll be honest with you, that is one of my absolute least favorite knives, because the thing is too long, the blade's too thick. At the toward the end of the blade, it has this bevel thing going on, which makes it's pointy enough that you can't like push on it with your finger or anything. That knife, I don't know if maybe it's great for butchering deer or whatever, but I kind of hate that knife. And it's not a quality thing. It's a great quality knife. It's just big, long, thick. I hate that thing. This knife is awesome. It's a Scandi grind. This is stainless steel, but it's great for cutting feather sticks, things like that. It cuts wood very, very well. Yeah, the Scandi grind probably isn't as durable overall as some other grinds, but I've been very happy with this thing. And yeah, I probably don't use a knife as much as some people do, but when I need to cut something, like cut a package open, cut some wood, little light cutting tasks, this thing is awesome. I really love this knife, and it's cheap. It gets the job done. I've been very happy with this thing. That said, I wouldn't mind necessarily at some point in time in the future getting a fancier knife that costs more than 17 bucks. Just kind of, I don't know, see how I like it, add it to my collection of gear or whatever. But yeah, you don't necessarily have to spend a whole lot of money to get a knife that's going to work really well for you. This one I tend to just string around my neck, a little bit of paracord, and I have a little cord lock on there so I can adjust the length. A great knife. Question number 4. Where did you learn all of your bushcraft skills? For me, I had many sources of learning in this regard. One of the first was being in Boy Scouts. When I was young, for some reason, I don't really know why, but I was always kind of drawn to learning like survival skills. I wanted to be able to, I guess, go outdoors and survive and have that skill set. And when I was in first grade, I joined Cub Scouts, or Tiger Cubs, I guess is the first year of that, hoping that I would learn this type of stuff. And early on in Cub Scouts, you don't learn any of that kind of stuff. So I was pretty disappointed in that, and I actually, after a couple years or so, I got out of it, and it wasn't until a few years later I got back into the tail end of Cub Scouts and Webelos, probably in large part because of a good friend of mine was in Webelos. So I joined up that last year and finished out through Webelos, and that you did get a little bit more of the outdoor stuff, a little bit more anyway. And then I went into Boy Scouts, and kind of through happy accident, I guess, I wound up joining the same troop that my friend joined. And the scoutmaster of that troop was a guy by the name of Dick Lundquist. And I remember my mom made the comment how Dick just looked like a real mountain man. He had a full gray beard. He always had like a flat top buzz cut. And as it turns out, Dick really was the outdoors mentor that I had really been looking for. Even if I wasn't looking for it in a single person, I really found a lot of that in Dick. He was a great teacher. It seemed to me, my young self, that he was a guy that had pretty much been everywhere and done everything outdoors, and he really was very experienced. He had spent, many days and nights out in the wilderness. I don't think I have probably ever personally met a person, before or since that has probably spent as much time outdoors as Dick did. And also in Boy Scouts, I learned a lot from the other adult leaders also. They all had a lot to share, and they were all great resources for learning. But when I was in Boy Scouts, the part about it I loved the most, without a doubt, was the outdoor stuff. I wasn't really as worried about getting merit badges that dealt with other types of things, and I wasn't as focused on the advancement. I never got my Eagle, and at the time I really wasn't worried about that at all. I really enjoyed learning the outdoor stuff. I really loved going on the monthly campouts, and over I don't know how many years I was in Boy Scouts. I was in from when I went in, as a Webelo graduate, on to when I was 18. I rarely ever missed one of the monthly campouts. Like, I could count on probably 1, 2, or 3 fingers the number of monthly campouts I missed. I pretty much went to all of them, just because I loved getting out. I loved camping, and you learn a great deal doing that when you do it as much as I did. And also a lot of the high adventure trips in Boy Scouts, where you went to different places like the mountains in New Mexico, or the trips that really, like I was talking about last night with the memorable camp question, those fly-in canoe trips up to Manitoba were just amazing experiences, and experiences I probably never would have had I not been in Boy Scouts, and in particular that troop, because I know that Dick really loved going up on those canoe trips. So while I was in, every 2 years the troop went on one of those trips. And also went on a winter trip up to northern Minnesota, about 20 miles outside of Ely. Spent the better part of a week out in the middle of a frozen lake on an island, and that was a really fun experience. And that's actually something that I've been putting some thought into, maybe trying to go back up there and do a winter trip on my own. I've also learned a lot over the years from books. When I was fairly young, I would go to the library, public library, or the school library, and search out books about camping and the outdoors and check them out and look through them. Some of those books I checked out several times, I'm sure. And a lot of them were older books that were published in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, some of them even the 40s. And now a lot of those books, I've tracked down used copies of them, and I own a lot of those same books. That's kind of something I collect, is kind of outdoors books, particularly some of these older outdoors books. So I learned a lot of good information out of those books. And a lot of them were kind of from the era where a lot of camping was more of a hands-on, kind of a bushcraft style of camping, and not as much of the, go to the store and buy all this camp furniture and everything and drive out and set up your little, your little home away from home with all this gear and, that type of thing. Some of these books were still from the old woodcraft days where, you'd go out and you'd hack down a bunch of trees and build shelters with tree boughs and things like that. Stuff that it's a good skill to know, but you probably shouldn't go out and do that nowadays because you're just going to tear up the resources, basically. Some of the authors that stand out are Calvin Rutstrom. He was a guy who lived up in Minnesota and I think up in Ontario. He died, I think, in the early 80s, if I remember correctly, but he spent a lot of time back in the 20s and 30s up in the canoe country, up in the North Woods, and he wrote a good number of books, and there's some really good books. And really just recently, I finally ran across Morris Kohansky's book, Bushcraft, or I guess it used to be called Northern Bushcraft. And also I've watched some of the videos of him talking about stuff here on YouTube, and I really like Morris Kohansky's stuff because, for one thing, you can tell he's experienced, and also he has a good understanding of why a lot of things work the way they work. He can tell you, a good way to light a fire or whatever, but at the same time, he can also kind of hit on some of the science behind why some of that works the way it works. I find that's very similar to the way I kind of look at a lot of things in life. I like to kind of, see that, something is the way it is, or it works or whatever. And also I like to kind of look into that a little bit and kind of see why is it that it works that way. Kind of applied engineering, scientific kind of into things. So I guess the two of us in that regard kind of think similarly. And also, of course, YouTube. I've learned a good deal of things off of YouTube. Folks just going out, creating content, showing a way to do something, or maybe a new idea, or just kind of an old skill that, the people have known about forever, and you happen across it on a video or something, and you can learn all sorts of stuff watching stuff on YouTube, obviously. Question number 5. What is your favorite way to start a fire? Well, I have to say recently, flint and steel has probably become my favorite way to light a fire. Years ago, I had a flint and steel set, which I had no idea how to use the thing. It probably wasn't really the best set anyway, because the steel striker was like a piece of stamped out steel, and I'm sure it worked, but I somehow thought you just bang the piece of steel against that piece of flint, and that sparks would come flying off of it, and they would land on some sort of tinder that you could actually get to light. And I think it came with a little bird's nest of like jute fiber or something like that. But no char cloth or anything. I don't think the thing had any instructions with it, and I just didn't have a clue how that thing worked. I struggled to even get sparks with that steel striker, that piece of flint, because I didn't even understand the concept that you have to scrape it against the like a sharp edge of that flint. So anyway, that thing was a miserable failure. I never got anywhere close to even starting a fire with that thing. But last fall, I got a really nice flint and steel set from the Townsend's company, and The first fire I ever started with that set, the first fire I ever started with flint and steel, was on a camp out on over New Year's Eve this last December, and it was about 0 degrees Fahrenheit out. I was able to light a fire with that thing pretty easily now that I have an idea of what I'm doing. And I find it's a pretty easy method for me anyway, to light a fire. It's just kind of fun and enjoyable and easy. It's a little bit more involved in some ways, and so if I want a quick fire, that's obviously not the way I'm going to try to light it. When it comes to ferro rods, I tend to struggle with that a little bit sometimes. Just some of the tenders I've tried using that I really thought would probably work pretty well haven't really worked all that well. There's definitely a learning curve with ferro rods. They're a good way to light a fire, and one good thing about them is that if it gets wet, it still works. Matches, if they get wet, sometimes if they get old, they don't work very well or at all anymore. So it's a more trustworthy method of fire. It's not completely indestructible or anything, but it's definitely more reliable than a lot of other things than matches or a lighter. Matches, I used to always pretty much use matches to light fires. I've really gotten away from matches because I just don't really trust the things all that well anymore. I've had so many of them where you light it and the head either just won't really light, or the sulfur on the head just kind of fizzles and never actually burst into flames. I don't really trust matches all that much. I always carry matches, but I don't trust them too much. A lighter is a great way for a quick fire. I always carry a lighter also, especially if I'm lighting like a camp stove. I'll oftentimes use a lighter. That's just quick and easy. If you need a campfire quickly, that's a good way to go. Lighters have some limitations. Obviously, if it's too cold, the fuel won't vaporize in there, so you have to be sure to keep it in your pocket. And that's not a big deal. You can always, unless you're in a really bad situation, you can always warm up your lighter. So that's not necessarily a reason not to use them. But anyway, they're a mechanical little contraption, so they can possibly not work, but lighter's a good option too. And my opinion is that it's probably a good idea, due to the fact that none of these things are very big or heavy. I really think it's a good idea to take matches, a ferro rod, and a lighter with you wherever you go. And maybe it's kind of overkill to have 3 methods. Maybe you only really need 2, but that at least gives you multiple methods in case for whatever reason you're having problems with one or the other. Question number 6. What is your most essential piece of gear? This was probably the hardest question for me to come up with my answer for. Now I'll say, I know that the wording of these questions has varied a little bit from video to video, but I'm just going to kind of play with the wording here. At least the wording that I got from Bushradical. I would say, the question asks about a piece of gear. I'm going to say, if we're talking about equipment, I would say that my single most essential piece of equipment is, and I know that this may sound kind of silly, but my most essential piece of equipment would be my mind with its knowledge. You could have all the gear in the world, and if you're unable to either know how to use it or maybe come up with a different way to apply it to a given situation, it's not going to do you any good. So your mind is very, very important. And not only that, your mind is what keeps you out of trouble. It keeps you from walking off a cliff. So your mind and your ability to look at a situation, size it up, see what you need to do, to maybe look at a situation and take a piece of gear or a resource that you have and figure out how to apply it to accomplish what you need. That's very important, very essential. However, I know what this question's obviously getting at. So I'll say when it comes to gear, I wouldn't say obviously that your brain is a piece of gear or your knowledge. So I thought about this quite a bit. Of all the gear that there is, the stuff I use, the stuff I carry, what is the single most essential piece of equipment? What do you really rely on the most in good, comfortable times? And what are you going to rely on the most when things are bad? Maybe you're in an emergency situation, the weather's bad, something bad's happened. When it comes down to it, I think, and I'm going to open this up a teeny bit, but I think a good set of appropriate clothing is probably my most essential piece of equipment, piece of gear. I had to open that up, not to just say a wool shirt or a pair of wool pants or whatever. I'm just going to say the whole package deal. And the interesting thing is, and I'm kind of borrowing this from Calvin Rutstrom in his book Paradise Below Zero. It's about winter camping. He talks about how human beings are the only animal who have figured out a way, who have the ability to take their ideal livable environment with them wherever they go. Because when you look at human beings, if you take off our clothes, about the only place, at least from a year-round standpoint, about the only place that we can exist without getting too cold and dying, or too hot and dying, would be in the tropics. I mean, it's the temperature there, at least most of the time, is such that you can get by without layering clothing on, or there's places in the world that are too hot for you to really get by. But humans have figured out through clothing how we can create our own little mini microclimate around us, and then we can go anywhere, really. I mean, traditionally, people have lived all over the globe except for Antarctica. All the way from polar climates with brutally cold winters to deserts where some of our deserts are very hot, and you definitely have to protect yourself from the sun and the heat, to everything in between. And it's our clothing essentially that allows us to do that. I think when it really comes down to it, in a bad emergency situation, as long as you have decent clothing on your back, that's going to go a long ways to helping you survive that situation. As long as you're warm, fairly comfortable, as long as you're maintaining your proper body temperature, and you have two legs that can walk, that's going to go a long way to allowing you to, number one, stay alive, and also to hopefully move your location to someplace else that hopefully in some way or form is going to help you get out of that situation. Maybe you'll happen across a nice cave that you can shelter in, or maybe you'll happen across help. But as long as you can keep your body working through maintaining your body temperature, and you can keep moving, you stand a pretty decent chance. I mean, somebody might say that fire making ability would be a most essential piece of equipment, like if you had nothing else. And I could see why that would be very important. But I feel that in a bad situation, if it's cold or something, if you have the ability to light a fire, that should be able to keep you warm. The problem is that's going to tie you to the spot where that fire is at. You're going to have to stay next to that fire in order to keep warm the whole time. You can't really pick it up and take it with you. Yes, you could definitely either take some of that fire with you to another location and build another fire and warm up there, or if you had fire making equipment, you could go somewhere else and light another fire. but it's not, you're still more or less tied from fire to fire at least. And if it's really cold out, you're not going to be able to go hike several miles and start a new fire. You're going to freeze in the meantime. See, generally speaking, you don't need a knife 100% of the time. You don't need water 100% of the time. You don't need food 100% of the time. What you do need, at least if the conditions, are such that your body's going to have a hard time maintaining its temperature, 100% of the time you're going to have to maintain that temperature. Otherwise, you're not going to last too long. If it's, say, cold out and you fail to maintain your body temperature, eventually you're going to become disabled, and if it gets bad enough, you're going to die. You get too cold, your brain starts not working very well, you make bad decisions, you stop thinking properly, you get cold enough, your body starts shutting down, you start shaking violently, you slur your speech. I've had that happen to me one time where I was on one of the canoe trips up in Canada, and the day was not cold. It was maybe in the 50s or so, and there was a section of the river where we had to get out and push the canoes up it, because it wasn't such that you could paddle up it. It was shallow and the water was moving pretty quickly, but it wasn't a full-blown portage type situation. But anyway, in the course of pushing the canoe up, I slipped off a rock or something, fell in the water, and got pretty soaked. And that was maybe late morning. And by the time we got to the spot where we stopped to eat lunch, I knew I was having some problems, because I was cold, and it was about the time that I tried talking and I slurred my speech that I realized that I was headed towards a hypothermic situation. So I started kind of running around to generate some body heat, and that took care of the problem. Basically, it warmed me up enough, and then I got to where the clothing I was wearing was mostly all wool. So, and yeah, wet wool doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stay warm, but had I been wearing a whole bunch of soaking wet cotton, that would have been a problem, would have been a worse problem. And I'm not saying that you can't ever wear cotton. This trip, I've pretty much worn a whole bunch of cotton, just because I know it's going to stay dry based on the weather report. So cotton's not necessarily a bad thing. Question number 7. Do you prefer an alcohol, gas, or wood stove? For me, that really depends on the situation. I have to say that I have a soft spot in my heart for liquid gas stoves, like white gas stoves. Part of that is just, growing up with the family having one of those Coleman 2-burner stoves that run on white gas. And through Boy Scouts, whenever we did use stoves on certain campouts or on some of those wilderness trips, they were always a white gas stove for the most part. I kind of like that smell that they give off as they're running, that sound that they make while they're running. I just like that. I do have a lot of camp stoves, and the majority of them are a white gas stove. And a lot of the ones I have, they tend towards the older, more vintage style of things. A lot of my stoves are older than I am. I really like the Spheas and the old Optimus, like 8R, those type of stoves. So I have a number of them. I enjoy using them, but they're not necessarily my first pick. Okay, the other type of gas stove, maybe the more properly titled gas stove, in English anyway, would be the like the propane butane type gas stoves, canister stoves, whatever you want to call them. I have some of these stoves. I have a few of them. And I like the smaller type gas canister stoves as part of a lightweight backpacking kit. I've definitely used them in backpacking before, and I think that they work pretty well in that role, where about all you want to do is boil water, that type of thing. Not to say you can't cook anything you want over one of these type of stoves, but these smaller backpacking ones, you're more limited. So I will take them backpacking. Outside of that, though, I'm not really a big fan of them. I'm pretty sure that the fuel cost on those type of stoves is higher than a lot of the other ones. It's a little tricky to know exactly how much fuel you have in that canister. Whereas like with a liquid gas stove, you can see it, you know how much is in there. A lot of times the way the stoves are made, you can't necessarily shelter it too well from the wind. So a lot of if there's a breeze, a lot of that heat just kind of gets blown out to the side and it doesn't even heat your pot. So they are very convenient. They're nice stoves in some ways, but I'm not really the biggest fan of them. Alcohol stoves. Recently, I've been really liking the alcohol stoves. I have a Trangia cook set. I have a couple of the old Swedish mess kit type alcohol stove setups. A couple things I like about the alcohol stoves is that, at least if you buy it like by the gallon, the denatured alcohol fuel or methylated spirits is pretty cheap overall. And the stove burners are very simple. There's really nothing that can break on them. I suppose that the brass might crack, but I've not had that happen to any of mine. There's just no moving parts, nothing to break. It's not like a white gas stove where it has a pump, because I've had all sorts of, you can have problems with those. And for instance, back in January on that cold trip I went on New Year's Eve, I took my Trangia stove. I took a couple of my alcohol stoves, and I also took an old Coleman Peak 1 backpacking stove, a white gas stove. And I had that Coleman Peak 1 start leaking fuel somewhere for some reason. I tried getting it to work, it just kept leaking fuel, so that one failed on me. However, that Trangia stove, even though it was a little trickier to light it with in the cold, because the alcohol doesn't light quite as readily when it's that cold, I was able to get those stoves lit, and I was able to heat up water with them. So the white gas stove totally failed me in that situation, but yet those alcohol stoves, because they didn't have any working parts to fail, worked great once you got it lit. And then 2 weeks later, I went out camping again in conditions that were cold. They weren't quite as cold. They were at least down into like the teens or so. And basically the same exact thing happened with a completely different white gas stove. I had it set up ready to go, and it kept leaking fuel out of the pump assembly. And actually, on that trip, I also brought another older white gas stove. And by this time, I wasn't even going to try using that one, because at the rate things were going, that one was going to fail on me too. But I did have the alcohol stoves, and once again, they saved the day. They worked just fine once you got them lit, and away we went. So alcohol stoves, you don't necessarily have maybe as much flame control with them, that type of thing. They might not, in some ways, they might not put out as much heat in certain situations, but I've had pretty good luck with them, and they're pretty reliable. Wood stoves. I don't have a wood stove, technically, but I do cook over wood quite a bit. And I have to say, to answer the question, probably my preferred way to cook would be with wood. The fuel usually is quite plentiful. It's free. You don't have to worry about running out of it. A A lot of times when you cook with wood, it smells good, depending on what you're burning. And I have to say, a pot hanging over an open fire has far more outdoors romanticism to it than any pot sitting on a like a liquid fuel stove or any of those. Also, cooking with a wood fire, it gives you a lot of options. You can put a pot, you put a pot over a fire, boil water. You can fry stuff in a frying pan, which, yes, both of these things you can do with other types of stoves, obviously. But it also opens up the doors to things like using a Dutch oven. You can also cook stuff using the radiant heat from the fire, like putting something in like a pan or on a plank and propping it up in front of a fire. You can't do that kind of stuff with just a camp stove very well, or at all. Question number 8. Do you keep a bug out bag in your vehicle? No, I don't have a dedicated bag or anything in my truck. Once I started thinking about this question, I realized that I do always have a flashlight in my truck. I always have a shovel, or even two. I have an entrenching tool and an avalanche shovel in there. Have some toilet paper in there. Have a knife in there. There's always like a zip-up hoodie laying back behind the seat. I have some wool mittens in there. And I even have a CB radio back there. It's not hooked up or anything, but it's back there. All I have to do is slap the antenna on top of the truck and plug everything in. And I have a way to communicate in a situation where maybe at least communicate with other people with a CB radio in a bad emergency type situation. So yeah, once I really started thinking about it, all I have to do is add a few other little things, just toss them in there, and maybe I wouldn't have a bug out bag, but I would kind of have a workable bug out collection of gear I could use. For me, for the most part, in a bad situation where things are really falling apart, in a crisis situation, I would be more focused on getting home, or bugging in, as you would say. There's food there. There's protection equipment there. There is lots of outdoor gear that could be definitely used to converted to living a kind of a forced off-grid lifestyle quite well. So if it came down to it, my first order of business would be getting back home, getting with my wife, looking at the situation, see what's going on, see what we need to do, and if we do need to bug out somewhere, then we could go from there. When it comes to like a get home kit in my truck, for me that's not really an issue. Where I live, if I was at work and things were really bad and I couldn't drive my truck for whatever reason, it wouldn't be that hard for me to walk home. It would take me a little while to do it, but it wouldn't be that bad. As long as I have something to keep me warm if it's cold out, and a pair of shoes, I'm fine in that regard. Wow, so this video got kind of long. I don't know if I got carried away with my answers or what, but I really tried to cut them back as best I could. But in the end, I really didn't want to take out too much of my answers, because I really feel that they were an accurate representation of me and my thoughts. Well, in the interests of moving this video along to a conclusion, here are my tags. In no particular order, and I have to say that my list went really international without me even meaning it to. On it we have 2 Canadians, a Finn, a German, and a Brit. So, number 1, I'm tagging the Wooded Beardsman. He has a great channel, a lot of interesting videos. If anybody's in doubt as to what eating meat entails, they really ought to check out some of his stuff. Number 2, hailing from the land of the lakes and the evergreen trees, we have Helsinki Pop from Finland. He has a lot of great videos. I think the two of us think a lot alike in some ways. Number 3, Kyle Noseworthy. A lot of awesome videos, kind of a neat range of stuff that he presents. I know that you're probably busy, Kyle, but hopefully you get a chance to do a little video of your list. Same thing goes for you, Wooded Beardsman. I know you're up to quite a bit right now, but I hope you find the time. Number 4 from Germany, Thor's channel. Thor has been putting up some neat, fun little outdoors videos. Number 5 from the UK, Prepared Camping. Rue, I hope I'm saying that right. I noticed that you're a little bit ahead of the game in the new channel department, but I wanted to tag you in this little challenge and thought you might have fun with it, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say. And again, a big thanks to Bushradical, Dave Whipple, for tagging me in this challenge. I had a lot of fun answering these questions, and I definitely had quite a bit to say. So thanks a lot, Dave. And I hope that your journey north is a good one this year. Well, that does it for this video. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I know that it drew on pretty long. I did have quite a bit to say, but thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit like, subscribe to my channel, hit the little bell for notifications, weigh in with your comments below, and until next time, this is Gareth with Mountain Coffee Outdoors. I'll see you then.